The attacks on Bernie Sanders and all the character assassinations that you're seeing right now continue, and the latest includes what's being referred to as a scoop in the Daily Beast. Scott Bixby writes about this, and they went all the way back to the 1970s to find statements that they felt were problematic. So Bixby writes, as the leading member of the self-described radical political party in the 1970s, Sanders repeatedly compared Vermont workers to enslaved black people, according to archival interviews obtained by the Daily Beast. In one 1976 conversation, Sanders told a local newspaper that the sale of a privately held mining company by its founders harkened back to the days of slavery when black people were sold to different owners without their consent, and compared the service economy to chattel slavery. Let me give you a quote that he made in 1977. Basically, today, Vermont workers remain slaves in many, many ways. He said this in 1977, in which he compared the service industry in the nearly all-white state to the enslavement of black Americans at the nation's founding. The problem comes when we end up with an entire state of people trained to wait on other people. So these are statements, again, from the 1970s. And I think that communication and being artful in the way that you try to make your point is incredibly important. And you have to be precise, you have to use precision. I think that it could, I understand where he's coming from and why he's making these points. And I'm gonna provide some of what the working class would say about being forced into this system during the Industrial Revolution. But before I get to that, I just wanna note, it is a bad idea to compare the working class to what black slaves went through in America. It was violent, it was brutal, like terrible. He's drawing parallels because workers have no real rights. And we don't get to make decisions about where we end up in whatever companies we work for. Decisions get made in a room by a group of people who get to decide what's best for them, right? And so I get the parallels there, and communication changes. And so I don't hear him using this kind of analogy today. And I think it's important that he stay away from using these types of analogies. But there are some similarities when it comes to choice and when it comes to oppression.
Yeah, and look, should he have made any sort of comparison? No, I probably wouldn't have. But let's be clear about what comparisons he's making. Very broad, general comparisons, not specific comparisons about specific offenses or anything like that. He made a reference in 1977. Now you can certainly still have a problem with that. If somebody has a problem with that, totally understand. And as we're both saying, we wouldn't make that comparison. But the thing that is being done is his more than a half century of advocacy for the working class is being twisted against him, which, I mean, that's some interesting gymnastics that his literal strength is gonna be used to attack him. But also, and this has nothing to do with whether if you have a problem with what he said, you can continue to have a problem. But let's be very clear about what's happening here. In that first graphic, when it says, according to archival interviews obtained by the Daily Beast, there's a thing that's not happening, a thing that's happening. They didn't go into Vermont's 1970 interview archives and obtain them.
100%.
They were obtained when they were handed to them by the Biden campaign.
Yes.
And that doesn't have anything to do with the content there. You can still have a problem with it. But if we're gonna be talking about dirty attacks and things like that, we have to be very clear about what this is. This is the Daily Beast functioning as basically a tool for the Biden campaign. They were handed opposition research and they're presenting it as if it's their own research.
Yeah, that's.
And by the way, take a look at some of the stuff Biden said back in the 70s, by the way, if you want to know what he thought about segregation and stuff like that.
I mean, he was against integrated schools. He was against busing. I mean, come on. Biden has no room to talk about this.
No, but there you're talking about policy and substance, not analogy.
Right. So look, he made a bad analogy, right?
He did. He shouldn't have done it.
But with that said, I do want to focus on how worker oppression was communicated historically in the United States. And Noam Chomsky actually talked about that during one of his talks. So let's go to this next clip.
If you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution in England and the United States and other countries, people who were being driven into the industrial system bitterly condemned it. In the United States in the mid-19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was beginning, working people described wage labor as equivalent to slavery. The only difference was that wage labor is supposed to be temporary, whereas slavery is permanent. Actually, that was such a widespread idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party.
So obviously communication changes, and using those types of analogies, because look, it minimizes the brutal nature and the violence that took place while we were enslaving African Americans in this country. So I get it, I understand why people would be upset, but this is all they got. Like they had to go back to the 1970s and find this. And by the way, the Daily Beast also writes the following, and I think this is a good opportunity to talk about the intersectionality of economic justice and racial justice in America, because I think the elites in this country have made people believe that they're mutually exclusive. But they're not, they're very much intertwined. And there are incredible scholars who have written about this, and I wanna talk about it. But the Daily Beast also writes, Sanders' previously unreported comparisons between the conditions of Vermont workers and that of enslaved people evoke a different element of his campaign. Assertions by critics that he tends to view systemic racism primarily through the lens of economic disenfranchisement. And look, I know that people think that's a problem, but it's the reality, right? Especially when you think about how the oppression of disenfranchised groups in this country have led to the working class and the poor mostly being dominated by, Black people, women, members of the LGBTQ. So if you were to pass these economic policies that uplift people living in poverty, the individuals that would benefit the most are actually the disenfranchised groups that establishment Democrats only pretend to care about when they want to exploit those groups for their own political gain.
Yeah, and look, it is accurate to say that he does primarily view it through that lens. He doesn't solely view it through that lens.
Correct.
There is obviously a very strong connection. It is not a 100% connection. He does not believe that, but he will always be presented as if that is what his political philosophy is.
Because policy can only go so far. And one of the things that I think is the most empowering about his campaign is that he's not relying on, all right, I'm gonna work with these stuffy politicians to try to make some reforms that could make your life a little better. He's about empowering you, giving you the power to demand a better life for yourself, right? To live under a better system. And Adolph Reed, I tweeted this piece, you should read the full piece, writes about class reductionism. And I think he does such a good job in showing the intersectionality that I was referring to earlier. So he writes, left identitarians and centrist liberals have used this oversimplified charge, not merely to dismiss Sanders, but also to cast suspicion on the broad array of universally redistributive policies associated with him and the left flank of the Democratic Party, such as Medicare for all, free public higher education, a living wage, and the right to collective bargaining. The simple fact is that no serious tendency on the left contends that racial or gender injustices or those affecting LGBTQ people, immigrants, and other groups as such do not exist, are inconsequential, or otherwise would be downplayed or ignored. Nor do any reputable voices on the left seriously argue that racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia are not attributes and ideologies that persist and cause harm. But then he writes about the importance of economic justice in uplifting groups, right? He says, Black, female, and trans people tend to be disproportionately working class. So any measure to advance broad downward economic redistribution from Medicare for all to a $15 minimum wage can't coherently be said to thwart the interests of women, racial minorities, or other identity groups. What's more, this brand of class denialism artificially separates race, gender, and other ascriptive identities from the basic dynamics of American capitalism. Read the full piece, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And read everything he writes because he's just an incredible thinker.
Yeah, I disagree that nobody asserts those things, but yeah, it's not the biggest intellectual voice or anything like that. People exist on a spectrum of what they prioritize in their politics. I get frustrated sometimes when I see people co-opting the language of the right to attack so-called identity politics, which I think in some cases can be used to marginalize concerns that don't benefit the largest groups in society. But it is obviously all interconnected, and I hate to see people try to, from the outside, oversimplify Bernie Sanders, both his political strategy, his political philosophy, and what the effect of his actual policies would be. TYT is all about challenging and disrupting the status quo, and so is aspiration. Aspiration does not invest your money into fossil fuel businesses that harm our planet, such as pipelines and oil drilling. Instead, you'll be able to fight climate change with tools like AIM, the Aspiration Impact Measurement, and Planet Protection. They also don't hit you with outrageous fees for you to access your own money. You can even earn cash back and get free ATM uses up to 5 times a month. Head to aspiration.com/TYT to learn more. For a limited time, get 30 days of free TYT membership when you sign up.